think it's 7 o'clock
Thank
in the
you.
evening. Let's begin.
Thank you.
So thank you everybody for joining this webinar on public sector enterprises. This is a subject that is kind of forgotten in Pakistan. सब भूल चुके हैं इसको कि कोई exist भी करते हैं कि नहीं करते. कभी-कभी IMF program में आ जाता है कि public sector enterprises हैं, but normally we forget, and especially the civil society doesn't seem to remember कि public sector enterprises हैं. और research में तो बिल्कुल नहीं है, because I've hardly seen any papers on public sector enterprises. तो जब इस्तकबाल मेहदी साहब ने जिन्होंने ये suggest किया, so I jumped at it because I thought it was a very good idea. Mehdi Saab is obviously one of the veterans of this area. He knows this area very well. So he's the man who's put this webinar together, and I'll invite him to come first and lay down the outline and tell us how to proceed. But let me begin by just quickly introducing the panel that we have. Obviously, Istiqbal Mehdi. He's been in public sector enterprises, and many enterprises, managed them. Been in the board of investment, been in the board of management, and set out a framework for managing these enterprises. So he's the right man to lead this webinar. And then we've got many luminaries. We've got Arshad Zaman, former chief economist of Pakistan, Dr. Arshad Zaman. I'm very happy that Istiqbal Mehdi has been able to pull him out. I've tried my best and found it very difficult to pull him out. Then we've got Salim Raza, the former governor of the central bank. Long international banking experience. He knows the public sector enterprises well too, so that should be very good. Then of course we've got Sikandar Khan, who is the main man behind Millet Tractors, getting it privatized, and ran it for a long time, still the chairman of the board, I think. So he is also very well positioned. Then we've got Tasneem Noorani, a well-known civil servant, Secretary of Commerce, Secretary Interior, many places. Tasneem Noorani Saab has been, he's obviously very well known, writes for newspapers, does many things, a very active judge. So this, I don't think you could get a better panel than this. So Istiqbal Mehdi Saab, since you are the architect of this, why don't you take charge and tell us how to proceed?
So interesting and great panel we have today, and probably I think the first one person who will be addressing the webinar will be Arshad Zaman. Arshad Zaman, on just that he will not be coming on the screen, but we will be hearing from him. So Dr. Arshad Zaman, and then others you have already introduced, so I don't have to, and they are already such well-known personalities, so we don't have to introduce any one of them anyway. So, so can we, Nadeem, can we invite Arshad Zaman to come in?
Zarur ji, go ahead, Arshad Saab.
Thank you very much, Istiqbal and Nadeem. Let me see if I can share my presentation.
Please do.
We can see this, Arshad, but we can't hear you.
Can't hear me anymore?
We can hear you now.
Oh, okay. I think I have to speak close to the.
Yes.
Bismillahir Rahim. It is really a privilege and a pleasure to speak to such a distinguished panel, experts on state enterprises. In my talk, I will try to confine myself to making 3 points. First, that how states should manage SOEs is by now well known. But second, that the main difficulty is that both governments and our scholars lack the self-confidence to take charge of our own fate. This is a mental block of sorts. So consequently, third point I would make would be that we should, for the time being, forget about offering policy solutions that the governments lack the confidence to implement. Focus instead on building the capacity for thinking and analysis that is independent of inapplicable imported generic solutions. This is what Nadeem was alluding to, I think, when he said,
can we make the sound slightly higher?
I'll try to keep my mouth close to the computer.
That's a good idea.
Is this better, Mehdi?
Much better.
Yeah, that's better.
Okay, so now my chin is more or less on the computer table now. So, and I'll try to keep it that way. So without further ado, let me review what needs to be done. Now, it is said that generals are always fighting the last war. In the same way, governments are perennially trying to correct past mistakes. Meanwhile, the world is going through the fourth industrial revolution, and we are still debating whether the steel mill was a mistake or not and other such matters. If we are to catch up and succeed, then we must stop looking back, look at where we stand and what lies ahead, and take risks and make decisions and take charge of our own lives. This seems obvious enough, but why haven't we been able to do this? To a large extent, I believe it is due to the widely held but mistaken belief that policy should be guided by ideology rather than pragmatism. This mental block needs to be overcome. Those who influence and make policy in Pakistan hold as a matter of religious faith 3 ideological positions that block pragmatic thought and action. This applies just as much to the research community as it does to governments. Number 1, that the state has no role in the economy nor in economic enterprise. This is almost a dogma wherever you go. Number 2, so the thing is to disinvest, privatize, and deregulate everything. And finally, number 3, that the market, this ghost in the machine, can provide everything. All that the government needs to do is to stand aside and let the private sector do business easily. Easily is code for meaning without oversight or regulation. Now, the origins of these dogmas have nothing to do with Pakistan. They arose in Europe, where fear of the Bolshevik Revolution and the rise of Hitler led to a distrust of big government. Much of it owes to Hayek, who was a political philosopher who as a teenager fought in the First World War, immigrated to England, and was afraid that the Labour Party might bring socialism to Britain. Clearly, none of this is true in Pakistan, but we had to absorb these dogmas in the 1990s as a condition of borrowing from international financial institutions, most notably the fund and the bank. This has had a disastrous impact on the economy in Pakistan. As you can see from the graph, from 1989 to 2002, I call these years the long IMF 1990s. The long run growth rate fell year after year after year for 14 years. In the first 3 years of the IMF 90s, the Planning Commission offered cogent reasons to the IMF why their prescriptions won't work. But the IMF was in no mood to listen. Their position was my way or the highway. So in the end, the government had no option but to comply, and exactly as anticipated, disaster followed. In an interview published courtesy of Nadeem in the December issue of PIDE's Policy and Research, I have estimated the economic cost of this policy shift to Pakistan in terms of lost growth conservatively at around $75 billion. The good news, however, is that 30 years later, a few months ago, an official IMF publication has recanted from this gospel of neoliberalism. In the initial years, the Planning Commission had taken the position that the issue with SOEs was managerial autonomy and performance monitoring, not the location of ownership. And it was intelligent regulation that was needed, not blanket deregulation. In the wake of the global financial crisis and the recent pandemic, the IMF has now come around to this view. It now holds that SOEs have an essential role and growing role to play in the economy, that privatization and deregulation of the kind that had been forced on Pakistan for 30 years should be avoided, and that the private sector cannot provide everything, and in fact, often has to be bailed out by government in the wake of crises. Since this would be hard to believe, let us hear this from Paulo Mauro, the Deputy Director of the Fiscal Affairs Department of the IMF, in an interview to Ben Hall, the Europe editor of Financial Times.
SOEs, Paolo, have been with us for many years. Why is the IMF focusing on this, on their role in the global economy right now?
Indeed. Hello, Ben. We decided to write the Fiscal Monitor chapter on state-owned enterprises because state-owned enterprises are important for people, they're important for the macroeconomy and for the public finances. So for us, writing a Fiscal Monitor chapter on this very important topic was a natural choice. What we have noticed is that over the past decade, state-owned enterprises have become more important in the global economy, and they have become more international. So just to give you an example, we look at the 2,000 largest firms in the world. These are both private and state-owned. And what we observe is that today, 20% of the assets of those are state-owned enterprises. A decade ago, state-owned enterprises represented only 10% in that group of the largest firms. So today, state-owned enterprises account for $45 trillion in assets in that group. This is a very important development in the global economy. Moreover, they have become more international. There are now many multinational state-owned enterprises. Just to take the example of Europe, there are 600 state-owned enterprises that are multinational and that are owned by governments in Europe.
In other words, while we were scaling back our state enterprises under IMF advice, SOEs were growing all over the world, including in Europe. So should we still privatize them all, as we are being told by the IMF? Let us listen again to the fiscal affairs staff of the IMF.
Coming to the question of privatization, we know that there are many different reasons why countries have a certain portfolio of state-owned enterprises. Reasons can be political, they can be historical. Maybe many years ago there was a crisis and a private firm was taken over by the government, it became state-owned, and then that never changed. So what we recommend to countries is that on a regular basis, they take a look at the state-owned enterprises one by one and ask themselves, is the rationale for having this firm still in the public sector, that rationale still valid? There may be cases, for example, in small manufacturing, where you look around and you see that private firms are already providing healthy competition in that market. So the rationale for having a state-owned enterprise in that type of market maybe is no longer there. Perhaps it was there a while back, but things have changed. In that case, it makes sense to consider privatization, but there are some preconditions for privatization to be effective. One is to make sure that the integrity of the sale of the firm can be preserved. So we don't want to give opportunities for a corrupt sale. The other thing is that once privatized, you may need an independent regulator to ensure that the privatized firm is balancing the needs of the consumers, the firms, and of the government. So there are certain preconditions before concluding that privatization is the way to go.
In simple words, the IMF has come around to our view that indiscriminate privatization is harmful. SOEs, they are now saying, should not be privatized until there are safeguards against corrupt sales, And there are arrangements to regulate privatized firms in the public interest, which we all know neither of these is true in Pakistan. So shall we leave it all to the private sector? Do state enterprises provide no essential services? Let us hear them again.
As I mentioned earlier, they provide essential services in many countries. So water, electricity, these are essential services. And if you think about the financial sector, some state-owned commercial banks or development banks have the ability to reach certain small and medium-sized enterprises, micro-enterprises, households, farmers, particularly in emerging markets, that the private sector, financial sector, doesn't always serve. So there's a role to play for state-owned enterprises right now. As you were saying, we've learned in past crises, including the global financial crisis, that during these big crises, private firms sometimes get into financial trouble, and oftentimes the government decides to inject equity, take them over. Particularly, that's something that is sensible if there is a future after the crisis. These firms are viable after the crisis, but they do need the public intervention to keep them alive in the meantime. So we may well see that there will be an increase in the size of the state-owned enterprise sector during this crisis.
गोया की मेरे कत्ल के बाद उसने जफा से तौबा हाय उस जूद पशेमा का पशेमा होना. Clearly, the solution to our problem lies in a close and continuous study of our own realities, to cross the river, as the Chinese say, by feeling the stones. One difficulty, however, is that under the neoliberal framework of policy making, the government has stopped monitoring SOEs. The result is that the latest data available to government today is nearly 4 years old. Nevertheless, even a cursory look at the old data reveals that all SOEs don't make losses. Many SOEs, oil, gas, petroleum companies, are highly profitable. And those that do make losses do so for very good specific reasons. The bulk of losses are confined to SOEs in two sectors: transportation and power distribution. Now, transportation can hardly be privatized, and losses in power distribution reflect the botched up breakup of WAPDA under the advice of the World Bank, badly and possibly corruptly negotiated contracts, and the failure to provide genuine independence to regulators. At the enterprise level, the main loss makers are the National Highway Authority, Pakistan Railways, and PIA. And after them, the 8 discos that are featured here in white. Interestingly, Pakistan's steel mills, much in the news, ranked 10th among top loss-making SOEs, while the losses of Sindh Engineering, which were 30% higher than those of steel mills, doesn't attract much attention. In short, the problem of SOEs are more complex than the often combative public discourse reflects. Of the 204 SOEs, only 11 enterprises, the 3 transport ones and the 8 discos, account for over 80% of the losses. The rest suffer from problems of enterprise management, sector policies, and the burdens of miscoordination between social, political, and economic strategies and policies. Clearly, as I have said before, there is really no substitute for a close study of each and every enterprise in any serious effort at better governance of SOEs. Since government has found this difficult, it is really up to civil society, and I endorse Nadim's opening remarks here, to expedite the diffusion of the latest lessons of thinking and experience on SOEs, which arrive at IMF also 5 years later. Within our community of scholars, concerned citizens, and the government, there is an urgent need, therefore, to create a network of experts, if not an institution, to provide governments not only in Pakistan but in the region, state enterprise boards and managements, and civil society with an alternative, evidence-based, locally appropriate framework for thought and action. I look forward to hearing and learning from the distinguished speakers who have been invited to this seminar. Thank you. وآخر الدعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين.
Thank you, Asab. Thank you very much. These are very interesting opening remarks. I think excellent, very well done. Ji, next shall we go to Salim Raza Saab? Ji, Salim Raza Saab, bataiye.
सर सलीम रजा साहब का माइक एनेबल नहीं है तो काइंडली सर नेक्स्ट स्पीकर को इनवाइट कर लें.
सिकंदर खान साहब, would you like to go next? ये तो उन्होंने बड़ी क्लियर बात बता दी है कि जी it is a failure at many levels, as is most things in Pakistan. Most things are failures at many levels. तो बताइए सिकंदर खान साहब.
Well, I don't know. I think my experience that I'm going to share with you is with Miller tractors, as you know. And I have to go back in history a little bit to state how it all happened, because I have the exposure to first private sector, public sector, and then again in the private sector. In the history of Millat is that it was a privately owned company by Rana Khudadad Khan in the middle 60s. And he bought this out from a British company called James Finlay, who were importing tractors into Pakistan. So he took over this company and carried on this business in a small manner. They were producing maybe 1,000 tractors a year for the next 10, 12 years when it got nationalized in 1972. I'm not going to speak too much about the time when it was being managed by Rana Khudadad's family because it was a very relatively small enterprise. It had a paid-up capital of 25 million to 2.5 million rupees. Now it's a completely different story. So we got nationalized during the Bhutto regime, and a lot of companies were taken under the government's wing as state-owned enterprises, and Millat was one of them. While we were nationalized, the government had essentially given us 2 or 3 objectives, which we were required to follow. I was a general manager here in one of the state enterprises and was transferred to Miller Tractors, perhaps in 1980 or 82. And the objective was to try and localize as much as possible of the tractor parts, so that the ancillary industry, the small and medium-sized enterprise, could develop in Pakistan. And that's what we were focusing on. And at the same time, try and bring in farm mechanization. In doing so, in Miller Tractors, I think it would be appropriate for me to mention General Saeed Qadir's support to this company and that of Mr. Ehsanullah Khan, who was a bureaucrat and had come into the private sector in the public sector days. And he was in charge of Miller Tractors. And we started the localization of tractor parts. And we were asked to make 75% parts in the next 5 years. We did reasonably well. We developed a new assembly plant with the capacity of 20,000, which was quite more than quite a large figure, bigger than what was being done in the country for tractorization. And I think it was a very important introduction into Pakistan, because being an agricultural country, we had to mechanize, and this was the first step towards mechanization. So we started manufacturing and we started assembly, and we had the support of our principals, which was Massey Ferguson, who supported us with the government's objective, and we were able to develop 70-75% parts in the next 5-6 years. But the important thing is that it was no longer a loss-making company. It was making phenomenal profits. It was very profitable in the public sector. And I think during this time in our experience in the public sector was very enlightening. I think we had the opportunity to send our boys abroad for training. We brought in technology. We brought in a lot of support from our principals, Massey Ferguson, and we embarked on this road for localization in a very serious manner. And I think that has been one of the major reasons of the success of this company in the public sector. When we had developed these parts, we became a very profitable company, and I think government support helped us in doing all that. And we were under the control of the Ministry of Production, and Ministry of Production was giving us a very good support in trying to develop and to achieve our objectives. But when we, in 1991, the government decided in its own wisdom that the nationalization should be reversed, and we should all the state enterprises should be privatized. But I must say that we had a very healthy balance sheet as long as we were in the public sector. And we had a lot of support from the government, so there was no interference from the other government departments, which I think was the best benefit that we could derive in the public sector. So in 1991, when the government decided that we should denationalize and reprivatize all the companies, or as many companies as possible, of which some are still pending, as that steel mill and some of the other loss-making units are still within the government's support and gambit. So we got denationalized in 1991, and here again I was supported by one of our ministers, Saeed Qadir, who said that we should go in for an employee buyout, which was a new experience in the country. Pakistan, there weren't very many companies that had gone for an employee buyout from the public sector till then. So we put a consortium together, and with the help of the bankers and the support of bankers, we were able to put in a bid which was the highest. We were 5 contestants, in which the employees were, there were 2 parties of the employees who were participating. Ours being the highest bid, we were handed over the company after that. But then the experiences that we faced being in the private sector immediately after an employee buyout, which was a very, very difficult position. I think we went through a very, very difficult time. And I think we had all sorts of problems. We had to contest legal cases. The parties who were also the second party from the employees took us to court, in which some vested interests were involved. And we fought the case in the courts, and we had to go to the Supreme Court level to be able to win them. And the government then handed over the shares of the company to us. And we were a group of more than 350 employees who had participated in the employee buyout, and we were able to start managing the company. But that wasn't the end of our problems. We were again challenged in agencies like FIA, challenged by other government departments, and we had a lot of difficulty in trying to sustain ourselves. But by the grace of God, we were able to do so, and we continue to struggle and move on quite successfully. So much so that, we were even NAB had taken us to court and they were investigating our privatization. Instead of doing that with the government and with the Privatization Commission, they were asking us all sorts of questions. Even today, after 30 years of having been privatized, we are still answering questions to NAB. They are still asking us what and how it was done. And we have to bring back papers which were 30 years old, dig them out and hand them over to NAB. So far, we've been able to keep above water, keep our heads above water, and hopefully we'll be able to do that. But the important thing is that we moved in the public sector. We had gone up to about 15,000 tractors a year. We have now been able to move on to about 40,000 tractors in a cyclical manner. And it has been very successful. And more important than that is that we have been able to develop the ancillary industry, which is now the backbone of the auto sector in this country. And we have got more than 350 vending units supplying parts to us. And in value terms, we produce almost 90% to 92% parts of tractors in Pakistan. Now that I think is an achievement which has come on the back of the public sector. I cannot take the full credit for that. I think it was the public sector that really laid the foundation for it, and we were able to build on that. Now, why was this successful? I think it was successful because we had a good management team. We had a team which was very, very cohesive, and we were able to move ahead without anybody pulling each other's legs and pulling us down, which was often the case in the public sector. But now we've been able to stay together. It is the same board that we had 30 years ago, and we are the private sector members keep changing, but the main members of Miller Tractors who are managing the company have remained the same. We have gone from management functions ourselves, and we have come on the board, and we have professional managers now managing. And this was something that we had learned again from the public sector. In the public sector, when we sent our boys for training, they came back, and I think we developed the level and skills of management. I think Istiqbal Mehdi will bear me out that he was also instrumental in supporting that to a large extent, and being in the institution like I think he was in charge of what was it called? Expert advisory cell and a special technical cell.
Expert advisory cell.
Expert advisory cell, and they were supporting us. They were there to support us. But that wasn't the case when we were privatized, and we really had to struggle hard to be able to stay afloat. Anyway, so that was what it was, and I think the experience in the public sector, to me, as an individual and as a company, has been very good. I think it is not the nationalization that creates a problem. It's the management of the company. Somehow it has been very unfortunate that most of the companies that are even today, as I see them and as has been displayed just now, they are companies which should be profitable. I know that transportation, railways, etc. are a different, but discos and others, they can be made profitable with proper management, in my opinion. And good government support could certainly be of help. So I thank you. I don't know whether I have conveyed what was expected of me, but I think my final analysis is that public sector can be good only if you have the right kind of management. If you do not select people who are coming on merit, they will never function. The private sector functions well because it chooses the right people and places the right people at the right spot, so that you can make the most of your opportunity that there is. So thank you very much again. I hope it's been interesting, but my life span with Miller Tractors has been extremely interesting. It has gone up from private to public to private, and now I'm happy that I took the decision joining Miller Tractors at the time when it was really down in the dumps. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Iqbal. Thank you, Nadeem Saab.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you very much. Very, I think a very interesting example of a successful privatization and a successful enterprise. So there you go. We've got the problem identified by Arshad Saab Kedi. It's not a large problem, but it is a large problem. It's a heterogeneous problem, not that every enterprise is loss-making, but nevertheless, the losses of the state-owned enterprises, to my account, and Arshad can correct me on this, I think amount to something like 30% of revenues. So we are in the continuous binge of trying to collect revenues while we are losing in the state-owned enterprises. So quite frankly, this is a sieve into which we are pouring our revenues. So Sneem Saab, why don't you come in and you tell us what is wrong with the management of these enterprises? Everybody agrees that they can be managed well, but yet we make a hash of managing them. Take, for example, the energy companies. I mean, I think they're a management disaster. Why are they a management? Railway is a management disaster. Why is it a management disaster? Even NHA has very good assets. It should be able to run its own business, but it can't. So where is the problem, Tasneem, sir?
Well, thank you, Nadeem, and thank you, Iqbal, for organizing this. And the two presentations, Arshad Saab and Sikandar's, have been very revealing in the sense that, sort of they recall a lot of things that one has been practicing. I come in, like Arshad Saab is an economist, and Sikandar is the person who's had experience in one industry. I've had a very multifarious experience and a hands-on experience in the public sector, especially in the golden era of the public sector, which was until the 80s. And, I was, and of course, Nadeem would criticize that, but I was a general manager in the Punjab Industrial Development Board at one time, managing rice mills. Those are the times when we were trying to protect things, and the Punjab government had set up small rice husking and polishing mills. Then I was managing director of Pakistan Mineral Development Corporation in the early 80s. And in that capacity, I was looking after coal and salt manufacture, because I have a degree in geology. So I was, then I started the Punjab Mineral Development Corporation in Punjab, the Panjmin, because public sector has been always shy to get into the mineral industry. Then later on, I joined the Ministry of Interior as a deputy secretary. And the government sent me for an MBA at this Harvard Business School, set up an institute in Tehran. So I went and did my MBA there. And then I came back and they sent me to the State Cement Corporation as kind of, vice chairman, director of finance. So there was a kind of career planning in those days. And in my personal experience in public sector organizations, I found that there were no serious issues of massive losses, except perhaps in the coal mines, at that time, because the technology was low. But for instance, in my capacity as Director of Finance and the Vice Chairman of the State Cement Corporation, we were managing all the cement industries of the country. There were about, I think, 19 cement mills. And we were taking care of the management, of the marketing, of the procurement, of the financing. Now, obviously, what was happening was that was the model that worked. All the general managers or MDs of those companies were professionals. Within this corporation, we had we had sort of general manager of finance who was a chartered accountant from the private sector. So the people like me were really overseeing and supervising and not interfering in the operation. As a matter of fact, supporting them with the government, with the regulators, with the tax issues, with the local. So we were like the troubleshooters for those, and making and of course monitors at that time. So the public sector, and then of course as in the Ministry of Interior, we were responsible. Ministry of Interior at that time when nationalization took place, we were looking after all the cement industry, all the fertilizer industry, all the chemical industry, all the auto industry, and the expert advisory cell was the consulting arm, which did all the analysis, the professional analysis of the results, technical analysis of the results, And that was kind of the thinking arm of the ministry. And we took, where the professional advice was required in taking decisions. The expert advisory cell came to our rescue, which kind of thing, I don't know whether it really exists in the government anymore or not. So, as Sikandar says, in those days, why they were successful then? Because there was no political interference. There was no media mischief. There was no, unnecessary exposure of everything. And the government was so sensitive to price hike that I remember Comrade Idris Saab, a very respected person, was an additional secretary in the Ministry of Production, and he authorized a 1 rupee increase in a bag of cement. And he was hauled up at the federal level. The government was very annoyed, and he had to face a lot of shouting matches. So that was the kind of control that the government had, and I suppose, since it was managed by the private sector or the individuals, there was no thing about excessive profiteering or excessive black marketing or the other issues that are currently there, which are pushing prices higher. But having said that, what Nadeem has said, that currently, we are on paper losing about 700, 800, 900 billion rupees a year on public sectors. Now, if they are of the industries that are inevitably to be done, obviously public sector, nobody wants to privatize education. Nobody wants to privatize health. Nobody wants to privatize infrastructure, which is the responsibility of the state. You can't privatize the military. You can't privatize the law enforcement agencies. So those are integral part of the public sector. And I think there is no debate, and there should be no debate about privatizing them. But marginal issues like PIA, like steel mill, like, I don't know, I'm surprised to hear that Sindh Engineering is losing more money than PSM. But if Sindh Engineering is losing, I don't know what it is doing with so many private sector auto industries. So therefore, governments have not shown the courage and the will. For instance, this government, should have been doing what they are trying to do with PSM now, 2.5 years later. They're talking seriously about privatizing it. They should have done that the first day they came, but they were at that time pandering up to the thing. So those are the things, I think, which give a bad image to the government. The discourse, again, as Sikandar said, are something that is an overall issue of electricity. The problem with our country is that the problems have become so large, like in the electricity, in the power sector. We are losing again 600 to 700 or 800 billion rupees a year, and circular debt increasing, and it's gone up to what, 1.8 trillion, and I don't see any light at the end of the tunnel, and nobody has any ready answers for that. Those are the worrying things as far as the public sector are concerned. And our government has committed too much. No country of our economic value promises a person gas in every village and nook and corner of the country, piped gas. No country, I suppose a country like ours, cannot really afford to provide electricity to all nook and corners of the country. I think there has to be some decision keeping in view your own resources. Now, what has happened is that because we have given that as an expectation, governments have really wagered their future on just the power sector. And I fear that the power sector is perhaps the one which is going to take the country down. When I read the newspapers and you see the kind of losses and the kind of debt issues that you have to, now you've reached a stage where you have to mortgage your roads and mortgage your parks. there has to be some serious thinking. The IMF issue is the other one. I'm not very sure whether the governments have not denationalized because of the IMF, the sort of issues. The issue is that the governments have not denationalized because they don't have the political will. These are really job. Some of these, I'm not talking of again. The areas that I listed out are something that are different. But the other 20% or at least 30% which are making loss making are the ones which the government should challenge. And I don't think that like PIA, I feel that the government should really declare bankruptcy. How is the US economy really surviving? There's so many ventures and so many. They have a system of declaring bankruptcy at a certain stage and then going restarting again. Here we are trying to fix PIA by bringing in new things. We are trying to fix the railways by unbundling, having tried that in WAPDA and seen the results. So we have to really take some bold decisions as early as possible. Otherwise, the debt trap that we are in doesn't bode well for the country. Thank you.
Dr. Nadeem, kindly unmute yourself, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Tasneem Saab. Thank you very much. So there we have it. We have state-owned enterprises can be run well. Enterprise is an enterprise. It doesn't matter how you run it well. The question is, why is it run badly? And I think this is the question that we should all come to. So let's take Salim Raza on this. Salim Raza साहब ये बताइए कि हमने बैंक्स प्राइवेटाइज कर दिए और बड़ा हम सोचते हमने मार्का मारा, पर क्या बैंकों की सर्विस बेहतर होगी लोगों के लिए या people are still suffering? Is the bank profitability dependent on competition? या जैसे मैं कहता हूँ कि बैंक्स का जो मॉडल है वो सिंपल है, 10-4-2, which is basically take government deposits at 4, lend at 10 and go for golf at 2. तो मेरा मतलब ये क्या हमने प्राइवेटाइजेशन अचीव किया है कि जनाब मोटी मोटी सैलरीज मिल रही हैं बैंक सीईओस को, बट येट द बैंकिंग सर्विसेज हैव रियली डिप्रिशिएटेड ओवर आवर लाइफ टाइम. सलीम रजा साहब, व्हाट्स योर टेक ऑन पब्लिक सेक्टर in general and banking in particular? जी.
There are, given everything that's been discussed, there are 2-3 things I want to touch upon. But let me start with the issue you've raised, privatizing banking. We are unusually among emerging markets, private sector dominated in terms of banking ownership, 80%. Where we have nothing effectively, nothing, is in the area of development finance. When you talk about SOEs, some of the biggest SOEs and the most effective SOEs are financial SOEs in emerging markets. Everywhere, China, Korea in its growth stage, Brazil today, all the different development banks in India. So development banks who have advisory capacity on subjects, besides lending capacity. So for the SME and for the agri, they work alongside them and they build their capacity. And then infrastructure finance banks, which allow you to structure projects based on the cash flow of the project, which we cannot do because our private banks, like private banks everywhere, do what comes naturally to them, which is a prime shareholder obligation. They want to stay liquid and they want to stay profitable, so they lend short term and they lend for working capital. So we have no capacity in this country for project finance, and we have no development finance capacity for the SME and agriculture. This was not always the case. It was notably not the case in the 60s. We've let some good institutions fade away, I think, in the hope that the private sector would do it, not understanding that nowhere in the world does the private sector enter development finance alone. It gets crowded in after leaderships given by public sector enterprises. And that infrastructure finance is always done on a PPP basis, public and private participation, We don't have those structures. Our power generation is not PPP. I mean, the government pays the bill. That's why banks finance them, because they're financing a government bond. Today, our position is that of our private banks, something like 65% of their loanable assets are to government, 50% in PIBs and securities, 15% in government guaranteed lending, be it IPPs, be it PIA, be it commodity finance. You know, there's about almost 800 billion rupees of commodity finance debt guaranteed by the government. And this is primarily wheat, but it's also what TCP buys, fertilizer, sugar, etc. So first of all, we've got this huge void in development finance, and that I wouldn't blame our private sector banks for that, because they were never meant to do it. So when we went in for this vast privatization, we left this gaping, obvious hole of who's going to carry the responsibility for developing those segments where private sector banks would automatically not take the lead. They'll follow, but they won't take the lead. That's one issue. And I think it's a very, very overdue. It's come up many times. We've talked about setting up an infrastructure finance bank. It hasn't happened. We went very far once in 2010. We thought we had one ready to go, but it sort of faded away, twinkling like a star somewhere in the sky. And then people talk about it now and then, but it doesn't go forward. Now let me go back to what Mr. Arshad Zaman had said earlier and some of the comments that we made. And since the subject I was given was financing, SOEs, there's a big issue. SOEs are, can be purely commercial, or they can have public sector obligations, or they can be a mixture of both. So purely commercial is obvious, that's what it is. So usually airlines, mining, energy, telecom, etc., in the public sector run as purely commercial entities. Public service obligation entities are things like water supply, some forms of transportation, the postal service, etc. And some are both, because, for instance, in power, the government may want the smaller consumers financed at some things that's below the cost of delivery. So you've got a mixture of things. Now let's take the purely commercial. The way to finance the purely, if the purely commercial are to be sustainable, they have to be financed on market terms. They have to be financed on the same terms as a private sector company in the same field, or in a different field, but on terms on which the private sector would get financed. That would mean that the company has to be able to control its debt equity levels. It has to say that this is the debt equity ratio we'll maintain. It has to target and try and meet an IRR, that's an internal rate of return. And number three, it has to have complete control over its dividend policy. If it doesn't, the government will extract value. The risk is the government, for budgetary reasons, will extract value from the PSEs. And we talked about our profitable PSEs. We talked about PSO. We talked about OGDC. There's the National Bank as well. There's the State Bank. The State Bank makes money from invested from all the debt that it sits on, government debt. Now, all this is taken out in a budgetary sense. So government, as the sole shareholder, bears the obligation to build the investment or the investment, build up the capacity of SOEs in time whenever equity is needed, new capital plans, expansion, and the government never does. All these things get taken care of by subsidies or by some form of debt floated off to foreign shareholders in the form of some sukuk or the other. So our commercial entities that ought to be able to manage their debt like a private entity cannot, because they cannot control their dividends, which are extracted. They cannot dictate their debt equity levels. It mustn't get worse than this. And they cannot, they're not independently, they're not able to meet IRRs they've established for themselves. Now, what's the solution? And what these temptations for government to strip out are there everywhere in the world. OECD's done a lot of work in the last 2-3 years. I mean, I agree with Mr. Arshad Zaman. I think there's a big return to focusing on governance in SOEs because this love affair with privatization, I'm not saying it's run its course, but it's certainly for the moment slowing down. And now there's a concern that SOEs are going to be picked. As a gentleman from the IMF who spoke a little earlier said, something like 20% of global asset investment in productive enterprise is in SOEs. And in countries, up to 45% of national output comes out of SOEs. And sectors like, again, mining, energy, telecom are dominated in many countries by SOEs. So they're a fact of life. And you're going to have to work with them. And you're going to have to make them, going back to finance, you're going to have to make them, their finance, market sustainable on market terms. Cold nose lenders should be able to come and look at them. How do you establish what's the consensus? So the OECD view has been, and I think the World Bank would support this, is that your company has to be able to meet a certain debt rating, a certain credit rating given by the global rating agencies, so that it can raise debt on competitive terms. Its rating has to be investment grade. Now, then work backwards.
वो सलीम की आवाज नहीं आ रही है. We can't hear you, Salu.
I can hear him fine. देखिए क्या हो रहा है? I can hear him fine.
Sorry, is this better? Arshad?
Go ahead. I can hear you fine. I think check करिए आपके वो उसमें होगा शायद कोई कंप्यूटर में प्रॉब्लम होगा. I can hear him fine. चलिए जी, go ahead.
So what they're doing in Europe, in many countries in Europe, is establishing that their SOEs will maintain a certain market credit rating so they can raise debt on competitive terms so that they can perform competitively and sort of genuinely produce revenue for government instead of having it extracted before they've even made it. So it's the bond rating that you then work backwards from. For this bond rating, what IRR targets do you need? What debt equity ratio do you need? And what your company's control, board's control on dividends must be. In other words, the level of dividends recommended by the board should be final. We know that with government that's not always possible, but at least if we had an agreement like that, we had benchmarks like a bond rating, that would be a start. I'm not saying we can work towards it tomorrow. We are very far away from it. And being as far away as we are, our path back is going to need a lot of changes in how government regards SOEs and financing SOEs and what it regards them as. Does it regard them as entities for the future, or as albatrosses round the neck that they must dispose of one way or the other? We can debate privatization of anything. Was it necessary? Was it good? Doesn't matter. Here we are. We stand with ownership of certain things. We can make them work. They did work once. Anyway, so that's the criteria for financing SOEs is you have to be able to give them competitive equivalence with market companies. Then I think associated with this, I've mentioned the lack of development finance institutions. That is something we can fix tomorrow. I mean, I honestly don't see any reason. I see no reason for continuing navel gazing. A lot of suggestions have been made of how these institutions can be created. A vast number in the past 5 or 6 years, in the past 10 years. So let me just leave that aside. We've got to have them. Without them, we cannot go forward. Our banking sector, I've told you for very good reason, will not fill that very, very critical space that is necessary for our development. The third thing I wanted to say is we've got to think of the management structure for our SOEs. I mean the overarching management structure. There's a spectrum of ways in which SOEs are managed. They're managed as underlying ministries. They're basically managed in 3 ways. There are overlaps and there are exceptions everywhere, but basically 3 ways. One is underlying ministries. The other is dual, the aligned ministry and the finance ministry or the planning ministry. And the third is centralized. So decentralized, dual control, and centralized. Centralized is there's either a coordinating agency that coordinates the needs of all the SOEs with the relevant ministries, or what I think is probably the best way, there's a holding company. There's a holding company for all the SOEs. That's what China has, called SASAC, State Asset Supervision and Administration Committee. And that is the way a lot of Asia has gone. Thailand, not Thailand so much, Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, and that's the way a lot of European countries are going. Have a holding company, that holding company, have a holding company and then have boards at the sector level, because there'll be 3, 4, 5, 6 sectors that your public sector enterprises consist of. And then there'll be the boards of the individual companies. So you've got 3 levels of boards, and you've got what you extract from a holding structure is you have synergy, you have transfer of talent, opportunity for development of talent, long-term career planning, and you feed your leadership from inside these entities. You don't fly people in from the government, for 6 months or 9 months or 1 year to manage them. You can attach people from government as coordinators, but the management has. So what structure do we want? We are presently under line ministries, or sort of under line ministries. I'm not quite clear that our ministries really have authority over the companies that fall in their remit. But so certainly, now this Sarmaya that's been talked about, I think is still a twinkle in someone's eye. I mean, I'm not sure. I know a committee has been established now to, look at taking the idea forward. But let's see what happens. But I think my recommendation very strongly is this holding company structure. So these 2, 3 things: revival of development lending, figuring out how we can make our commercial companies financeable on market terms, and number 3, what framework of ownership do we want our SOEs to function under? I mean, the 3 critical functions of the ownership really are appointing the board, setting and monitoring performance objectives, and voting the shares on behalf of the company. Who's going to do it? If you've got different line ministries, you've got very, very different patterns, very different ideas, and you can run into each other, you can replicate, you can block each other. A holding company will unclutter all that. And I think it'll have a lot more elegance and effectiveness. Anyway, that's just a thought. By the way, one final word. Agriculture is, long neglected, we know that. But I would, recommend that you look up, if you have 10 minutes, just look up Embrapa. This is Brazil's agricultural research organization, EMBRAPA. It is phenomenal. Brazil is the world's 2nd largest exporting country for agriculture, about $82 billion. They're the world's biggest exporters of soya. Soya is not a tropical crop. Brazil is a tropical country. Soya is a temperate crop. It needs 4 seasons. Now, how did Brazil develop it? Intense research. This Embrapa has 2,500 PhDs, 10,000 staff. Embrapa has 45 centers of excellence. Each center of excellence is devoted to some aspect of improved crop productivity or livestock productivity or growth or change in the pattern of planting, from forest to field to whatever, for sort of resurgence of the soil. And then it has 11 centers of centers working on common themes like, for example, better water management, like seed development, like soil development. And that is primarily responsible, that research organization, which is funded by government, funded by multinationals, by the multilaterals. It has research branches across Africa. It brought Indian cattle, Nellore, I think that the name of the cattle was, to Brazil, and sort of experimented with, strengthening the national the natural build of the animal, and is now it's the world's 2nd largest beef exporter. And the bulk of their product is this Indian cattle. So they've adapted it, improved it, and they do this with a lot of stuff they bring across from Africa. So we have nothing like that. And then as an agricultural country, I mean, that is the biggest missing hole. We know that. So I think, development finance supplemented by research, all these things that I've mentioned, I think, time to discuss, think about, but decide on. Otherwise, we're going to continue to go around in circles as we have been doing. And the PSE, I haven't used the word privatization. I'm just talking about organization. And we can decide whether we want to privatize some of these or do what. But fix how you're going to manage them and decide what you want out of them first. Thank you.
Thank you, Salim Saab. Thank you very much. जी इस्तकबाल मेहदी साहब, pull it together. जो मुझे नजर आ रहा है इशू, जो मैं नोट्स लेता रहा हूँ, मुझे तो लग रहा है कि ये सबसे बड़ा एक मैनेजमेंट का इशू है और इस कंट्री में, इस मुल्क में हम कुछ भी मैनेज नहीं कर सकते. ये भी एक अजीब चीज है जो मैं पैनल के सामने रखना चाहता हूँ कि बड़ी अजीब चीज है. हमारी कंट्री एक वाहिद कंट्री है मेरा ख्याल जहाँ सबसे बड़े एंटरप्राइजेस स्टॉक मार्केट पे पब्लिक सेक्टर ओन्ड एंटरप्राइजेस हैं और ये भी नहीं कि उनमें कोई बहुत बड़ी फाइनेंसिंग हो रही है. 10-15% पे वो बने हुए हैं, प्राइवेटाइज होती हैं. और जनाब PSO की मेरे ख्याल 10% प्राइवेटाइज हुई. इट्स द लार्जेस्ट ऑर्गेनाइजेशन इन द कंट्री. बट आई वांट यू टू फोकस, सलीम साहब, ये जो सारी बातें की, यू आर द आर्किटेक्ट, आप पुल इट टुगेदर और ये बताइए मैनेजमेंट इशू है क्या. पब्लिक सेक्टर एंटरप्राइजेस के बोर्ड्स देखता हूँ और मैं अपने दोस्तों से पूछता हूँ जो अच्छे इकोनॉमिस्ट, अच्छे लोग हैं, पढ़े लिखे लोग हैं, वो तो किसी बोर्ड पे भी नहीं है. कौन है बोर्ड पे? अभी हमने बोर्ड्स का एक एनालिसिस किया PID में. बोर्ड्स पे एक छोटी सी, सारे बोर्ड पे प्राइवेट और पब्लिक, ये भी सुनने वाली बात है सलीम साहब, तस्नीम साहब, हमने बोर्ड्स का एनालिसिस किया. बोर्ड्स पे सिर्फ कराची, लाहौर, इस्लामाबाद, मेनली कराची के सिंध क्लब के मेंबर्स बोर्ड्स पे हैं, या थोड़े ब्यूरोक्रेट्स हैं या थोड़े जनरल्स हैं. सोसाइटी के बंदे बोर्ड्स पे कोई नहीं है. लाहौर में आ जाए, पंजाब क्लब के मेंबर्स है. तो बोर्ड इज अ वेरी स्मॉल क्लब. तो हम बोर्ड्स को ट्रस्ट कर सकते हैं? सलीम साहब कहते हैं सरमाया बनाए तो बोर्ड्स में तो वही मेंबर्स आएंगे जो क्लब, सिंध क्लब, पंजाब क्लब के मेंबर्स हैं. इज देयर नोबडी एल्स इन द वर्ल्ड, इन द कंट्री? तो इसका मतलब हमारा तो बहुत बड़ा मैनेजमेंट चल जाए. इकबाल साहब बताइए.
Thank you so much, Nadeem. What a pleasure it is today listening to all the great scholars, experts, and professionals. One of the unique thing what I'm hearing today is nothing. Public sector is not being condemned. Typically, when you go to anywhere in Pakistan and you talk about public and private sector, the first thing you hear is about the condemning. What a curse public sector has been. And I wanted to basically, Nadeem, I wanted to give a very quick brief about one of the success stories is in Pakistan we have had, and this addresses to the question and issue you have just raised. What is wrong with our management? Why don't we have successful management here in Pakistan? I shall start my state enterprises experience in Pakistan. In the 50s and 60s, public enterprises in Pakistan was reasonably doing well. And in fact, to the extent that I confess that in some of the places where I went for consultancy and advisory in many other countries, I used to take Pakistan as a model. And I used to present Pakistan's state enterprises as a model. Well, of course, those were the different days. Anyway, let me talk about it. That public enterprises were doing reasonably well till we had this nationalization of early 1970s, which added the more public enterprises. And the result was that we had 29 manufacturing enterprises already, which were called the PIDC public enterprises. Adding to them was another 33 nationalized units, making them 62. The problem was that nationalization did take place, but nobody had thought how it is going to be managed. The result was that 62 public enterprises, Pakistan never had an experience of managing 62 large public enterprises. And this kind of conglomerate was somehow had to be managed. And to manage that, the government typically set up number of committees, commissions, and all of them. And all of them had everyone except the professionals who knew about public sector enterprises, the specific issues and the problems of public enterprises. And the result was that the whole of 1970s up to early 1980s, we have had some of the worst management of public sector enterprises. The country which had experience of, fairly good experience of enterprises like WABDA and, many other institutions in the financial sector, suddenly had these heavy loss incurring public sector enterprises. Till in early 1980s, we have had an experience of setting up what is it called, the expert advice cell by the Ministry of Production. And I can tell you one thing, it was not really a very well thought out setup in the beginning. It was just considered that there should be no board of industrial management, which was managing the earlier public sector enterprises. That board of industrial management should be winded up, and it should be replaced by an independent agency called Expert Advice Cell to advise the administrative ministry called Ministry of Production. The experience of the Expert Advice Cell was relatively unique. It was an advisory board full of professionals advising the Ministry of Production to how to control the enterprises. And who would know better than Tasneem Noorani sitting there, who we were really starting a new game of managing enterprises by the ministries, but with the advice of the professionals. And for a change, one of the unique experience where the professionals were advised was really taken, not necessarily the advice that professionals were all that good and a thing, but it was just basically a good discussion and interaction between the public sector enterprises management and the bureaucrats in the Ministry of Production. And it was one of the unique experience of success. How did it take place? And if I can tell you how we started that, it was basically a program of reforming state enterprises was launched. And the first thing we addressed was the setting up of the autonomy structure. And the autonomy structure for a change was not just allowing the managers to do just what they wanted to do, but based on somewhat well thought out scheme, which we had actually borrowed from the two very well known scholars from the US. They had prepared, they had advised and suggested autonomy structure for the large private sector enterprises. And those basically this autonomy structure had identified that the owner should do only 6 things: set objectives, evaluate performance according to those objectives, reward and penalize chief executive, appoint the chief executive officer, provide resources, conduct long-range planning and coordination, and the 7th, most important, do nothing else. And this was probably the most important thing: do nothing else. Not that we completely followed this, but we somehow took the spirit of this kind of recommendation. And the result was that there were 75 industrial enterprises under the Ministry of Production at that time, who were being managed through 8 holding corporations. And those old 8 holding corporations were managing these 75 industrial enterprises under the control of the board of directors, who were, relatively speaking, really autonomous and following the adopting and using the autonomy of in the real sense. What exactly did we do? We adopted the autonomy structure. We followed, adopted another enterprise system called the signaling system for state-owned enterprises. And if I can mention one thing, that this has been generally the experience all over the world, that let me shift to where, yes, that's right. This is the international experience, that the performance evaluation has been relatively weak in the public sector enterprise. Why? Basically 2 reasons. One is generally known, that they have multiple objectives. They have commercial as well as non-commercial. But another one is the plural principles. Different organs in the government have different perceptions about the goals of the enterprise. The Ministry of Labor will look at look after the interest of the labor or the manpower. The Ministry of Commerce will look after the interest of the trading side of the enterprise, and various other areas. So every element of the government organ had a different perception about the objective of that enterprise. It was this kind of combination of the 2 various kind of objectives, which each one of them thought the public enterprise should be doing. And the result was obviously that the enterprise manager could not identify the exact objective. What is it he's supposed to do? Is he supposed to set up the enterprise, the well-managed enterprise, or is he supposed to construct a road which he is getting an indication from the government to set up a road, or provide education to the the area where the enterprise is located? The result was that there was a confusion, complete confusion of the multiplicity of objectives. How do we do that? We had set up a very unique experience of what is it called, the signaling system of public enterprises, which revolved around the performance evaluation of the manager. How do we do that? How do we do that is, first of all, exactly identify what is the key performance indicator they should adopt. And it took us about 2 to 3 years working on the various, some of the most complex these criteria which we had developed, to find out what exactly, and to work on the development of those criteria. How do we identify what is it the enterprise should be doing, and what is it which they should be performing, and how those performance should be assessed. That is another element which had to be worked out. The result was that we came out, we developed this 3 years work on the, what is it called, public profit and the private profit. And public profit, we had worked out, working to identify what is it which we can get out of an enterprise, which means what is it, the box which we have, the black box, and what is we can get out of that. The result is that we were able to identify at the end of the day, that if there is any one criteria which really is able to identify what enterprise should be doing is profit. Profit, okay, but assessing it in the correct manner. There are areas which are not supposed to be assessed. They are not supposed to be done by the enterprise, but there are other areas which the manager does it for the enterprise, but it is not assessed at the time of evaluation. So the result was that we had to work out a simple way of assessing the evaluation of and I would like to show a performance contract which we had adopted. Profitability, yes, certainly is. It was profit divided by total assets, top and profitability. But in that, the profit should be assessed correctly. I'm not going to go into the details, but that should be. The subsequent partial indicators will indicate why this becomes a relevant criteria of evaluation. Physical production, fine. Once we have established the profitability as the primary criteria, the important thing is that it should be assessed by the real productivity. How do we do that? That is by the way we identified 4 major costs which an enterprise, a manufacturing enterprise, incurs. One is he buys the raw material. Second, he expends, the electricity which he incurs, the cost of electricity which he incurs, gas, furnace oil, labor cost, financial expense. So if you are attaining that target of the profitability, which is also linked with these real costs, because here we are assessing the real cost, not in terms of financial cost, but in terms of the real cost, which means the value of those costs. The labor cost, how much you are paying to the labor. To the financial expenses, how much you are paying for the borrowing which you have borrowed, and what kind of cost you have to pay for that. And electricity, not in terms of what has been the price of electricity, let's say, which was X last year, and this year it is X minus 1, which means that it is a cheaper electricity, and then I'm showing a good profitability. No, I have to show exactly at the same price where I had assessed and had set up the target for those enterprise electricity consumption. So the result was that we have been able to evaluate the performance of the enterprise by way of assessing, comparing it with the target. Now, when I say comparing it with the target, that is where the greatest issue which came. How do you set the right targets? And that is a very, very difficult task. And who would know better than Sikandar that sometime the expert advice cell people sat down with the team of Sikandar, and Sikandar being a tough, managing director, we sometimes spent the whole day coming to some point and some agreement. And finally, we always came to this agreement of assessing, reaching a certain target. Now, target setting is one of the most critical element in the performance evaluation. Generally, when you go to an enterprise or you go to any public sector enterprise, they will set up a target which is a letter from the ministry that you are supposed to attain this and this and this. In case of expert advice cell, the managing director was invited. Before the managing director's team was invited, they had sent on a certain budgetary proposals, which the unique thing about those budgetary proposals was that the cost and the value or the cost and the price was always there was a breakup of that. So we could always see what is exactly the total cost in the real terms, not in terms of the prices of last year and this year and showing the profit, but just because the prices have declined or prices have gone up. The result was that we were able to come out and compare the profit, what should be the profit at the end of the year. Now the problem which is always there, that at the beginning of the year, you always set up a target, but during the course of the year, things change. Things change, and there is what assumption you have established or assumed at the time of the setting of the target, things have by that time changed. So to address that issue, we had set up a very, I must say, relatively, at that time, relatively efficient MIS system. The MIS, it was one of the first few the ministry where MIS was established, and our advisors who had developed that MIS for us in the expert advice cell. Only today I was seeing they are one of the leading software firm. I can mention the name. It is the Systems Limited who had done this job for us, and we were able to. So the objective was that the MIS was an early warning system provided us that if their assumption was wrong, then we could always go to the ministry, we could always go to the relevant people and indicate that, look, the assumption on which a budget was formed or the budget was made, now this has to change. And I can give you an example. There was a fertilizer factory not very far from here in Hazara called Park China Fertilizer Factory. And its capacity at that time, it was a small urea fertilizer factory, and it used to produce 90,000 tons every year. And we said, okay, 100% capacity utilization, it has to be, that is the target. But during the course of the year, there was, the government decided that no, the gas which is being provided to Park China should be used somewhere else, maybe for the domestic purpose in somewhere in Pindi or Islamabad. And so instead of the gas for 90,000 tons, the gas was provided only for, let's say, 70,000 tons. Now that assumption, that assumption was changed, and it must be taken for granted. If we do not take it for granted, but then otherwise at the end of the day, we would have said that no, you did not produce 90,000, you produced, let's say, 70,000. So the result is that your performance has not been as good. But you have to take all those elements into consideration. And because it was taken into consideration, not once, not a single chief executive ever challenged the evaluation which was done by the expert advisor. And this was one of the things. I would also like to point out that when we were setting up the target at the beginning of the year, We never set up the target just for one target. We set up for 5 various level of performance, which means at A grade unit will get 3 bonus, B grade unit will get 2 months bonus, C 1 month, D 15 days, E nothing. The result was that not only that the performance was being evaluated, it was being evaluated without any challenge ever, not that I experienced, and also that had created some kind of a competition among the various units. Simply gaining the a certain grade itself was a matter of honor for the chief executive. It was, of course, the pecuniary benefit which you get in terms of 3 bonus or 2 months. That also it matters a lot. But for the chief executive to get the bonus of 3 months and A grade was a matter of, an honor. And we are talking to one of the chief executives who always got A grade, and who is in the present company today. So this is the another element which was taken into account. The last thing I would talk about, we kept looking into the problems and the issues with our management, with our work which we were doing. In the system I'm just talking about, we had to identify ourselves that there is one problem. This system is evaluating performance on the annual basis. When it is evaluating the annual basis, the managing director or the manager is always looking at the horizon is only 1 year. It had to be expanded, because if it does not, of course, we are not talking about one of the finest chief executives who is sitting here, but we are talking about some of the chief executives, let's say in fertilizer or in other cement unit, where there was some kind of incentive to produce and make profit for the year, not necessarily caring what is it going to be like 3 years from now or 4 years from now. So we had to think. So what we were doing was that we were evaluating the enterprise or encouraging the enterprise to be a good performer, but only for 1 year. So to address that issue, we thought of setting up a corporate planning system. We adopted this system by taking it from Arthur D. Little, and the result was that we got the Arthur D. Little model, and who helped us in developing corporate plans for 5 years. So those 5 years, so every manager, the model was such that plan, we were only leading them to develop that plan. The plan itself was actually owned by the managers themselves. It was them who were feeding us, and it is based on their information, that we developed those corporate plans, which became the basis of the budget, the annual budget for the enterprise, and which later on also became the basis for the target setting of the expert advice itself. So in turn, what we are saying is that now the manager was not only looking at what he is going to do during the course of the year, but he was also looking at what he is going to do for the coming years in future. And in our system, we modified the system in such a way that we should not only give them the credit not only of maximizing the profit, but also how much did he spend on the R&D, the research, how much did they think in terms of a plan for for the for learning what is happening in other countries of the world and the new technology, and they adopt and they prepared a plan to adopt those technologies. And so that means there was the program which we had developed to, first of all, to improve performance, which improved for during the course of the year in a static situation, but we also took care of the issues in the dynamic situation. So this is in general. I can tell you that what we did for the in the expert advice cell in those 10-15 years, the results of the efforts made by the professionals in the expert advice cell gave results within 3 to 4 years. And I can tell you that this has been said not only by me, not only by the managers of the expert advice cell, but number of the professionals in the World Bank and in the other multilateral agencies. They took it as a case study and they evaluated it. And I can tell you that Mary Shirley, in her report on the report, I think it was called Performance Evaluation of State Enterprises in Pakistan. In that, she worked out that in 3 years' time, the profit of the 39 enterprises which were covered under the signaling system or the system which was developed in the expert advice cell doubled the profit which it was at the time of the beginning of the whole process. And the result was that not only that expert advice cell was generally became fairly acceptable, and then also I must say a favorite of certain government agencies and the government other ministries, that our scope in the beginning was only for setting up target and monitoring and evaluating only to the manufacturing sector. But one day I got a call from Mr. Wasim Jafri from the Ministry of Finance, and he said, Mehdi, it is time that you expand the horizon of the expert advice cell from manufacturing to non-manufacturing. And we were asked to evaluate and bring the other non-manufacturing enterprises also into the purview of expert advice cell. And some of the enterprises of them where we were talking about railway, NHA, and others. Unfortunately, this was initially, this work was done for 2 years, but by the time this thing was started, it was prepared, was ready to go into operation, then the process of privatization started, and then this thing went into some kind of background. So this is what I wanted to give Nadeem, that there are also certain success stories, unfortunately. What happened is something I must add, that is that the expert advice cell, which was taken as a model by a number of countries, I can mention 2 or 3 where I myself went and established the system that was in Mexico and Philippines. And by the way, next door, Next to it was adopted, except that they never called it we used to call the system, the signaling system, they call it MOU system. But it was, and at the time of launching these systems in the over there, I was personally invited to help them in setting up some of the problems and some of the issues which they had faced. So this was my small little contribution to introduce what we had done in the past, and I would suggest that what Arshad Zaman has just talked about, that there should be, we should set up some kind of a network or some kind of institutional arrangement whereby not only the experience of Pakistan, but of the other countries may also be taken up, and then because we have had a fairly good experience, as I mentioned, that we had the experience of good performance, reasonably good performance in 50s and 60s, fairly good performance in 70s, 80s and 90s. And obviously now we are in a difficult situation, and it's a very ironical situation that the country which was a model at one time, I can tell you without mincing my word, that the country which was taken as a model in number of countries is to address the issues and improve the performance of their corporate bodies, is today we need some kind of assistance to address the losses of our public sector enterprises. So with that, I would like to thank you for
thank you, Janab Mehdi Sahab, thank you very much, very kind of you. अब मैं पैनल के पास थोड़ी देर के लिए वापस चाहता हूँ, we are about to end, but nevertheless, let me take up a few questions. Salim Raza साहब, जरा बताइए कि you were in Citibank for a long time, and Citibank was in Pakistan. I think now it's kind of left, although it's still there. But McDonald भी पाकिस्तान में है और बहुत सारे enterprises पाकिस्तान में है. What I find surprising is कि कोई बंदा headquarters से आता नहीं इनको manage करने के लिए. मेरा ख्याल मैंने कभी नहीं सुना कि headquarters से कोई आता है. Yes, Shaukat Aziz आता था, but he came for a different reason. I don't think he came to manage Citibank. He came for other reasons. But nevertheless, I don't see any real John Reed कभी नहीं आया, वो Riston कभी नहीं आया, कोई नहीं आया. तो decentralized management मुझे लगता है दुनिया का call है. Decentralized management बहुत अच्छी चलती है. McDonald का head कोई नहीं आता, ना McDonald को कोई पूछता है, Pepsi का कोई नहीं आता. But yet system बड़ा अच्छा चलता है. Why is it that we can't establish a management system? Why is it, और तस्नीम नूरानी साहब next, कि ये क्या वजह है कि मिनिस्ट्रियाँ, सब कह रही है मिनिस्ट्रियाँ चलाती हैं enterprises, और मेहदी साहब ने बड़ी अच्छी चीज़ दी, but my only disagreement with मेहदी साहब is कि यार ये तो central planning है थोड़ी सी. How can we have decentralized management which the world seems to follow and grow very well? Because all these multinationals are in every country in the world and growing very rapidly in every country in the world. Google ko le le, Facebook ko le le, वगैरह वगैरह, whatever. So please, Salim Raza sir, what is your take on this? Why can't we establish a management system? Is it the old boys club or is it something else?
You know, you have to have the courage to delegate. In these type of organizations that you're talking about, you built your own goals as a country. You got them signed off at the highest level necessary. Now you were delegated all the expense. It might have been, you know, a few $100 million. It might have been a few tens of millions of dollars. And you were delegated all the signing power, you know, all the credit lending power that you needed to achieve those goals. Now, sometimes you broke your neck and there'd be accidents. By and large, you took this as, you treated this delegation as a sense of ownership, and you worked as if you're working for your own company. But then the institution has to have belief that they have trained you well, that they've promoted you rightly, that your promotion was based on merit, that you are the best guy for the job, that you've been given the experience not only in that country, you've had a chance to work in other countries, and you've had a chance to work in other disciplines within the organization. Now, this is a leap of faith based on training and based on evaluation merit. That's really what you need. Are we prepared to look at our public sector heads in the same way? They'll need a lot. I don't know what they'll need to convince a ministry or whatever format they function under. I don't know what they'll need to do to convince them to let them spend more, to let them sign bigger deals, bigger transactions. Will they be able to persuade their up the lines that they need to merge with another company, that they need to acquire another company? Now, if you don't have the freedom to do that, if you don't have the courage to do that, because that whole initiative is not meant to be part of your ambit, then you're not going to get what you've described, which is little satellites functioning on their own, which is what you need.
तो स्नीप साहब आप बताइए ये क्या वजह है कि I notice, and I think all of us notice, that most of the public sector enterprise CEOs are sitting in Islamabad almost every week for 2 or 3 days with ministries, with meetings with the ministries. When do they do their work? I often ask them, yeah, doesn't this interfere with
Actually,
yes.
बात ये है कि I think this is the worst time to be talking about managing public sector, because we've reached a stage in the governance level where managing anything at the state has become difficult. And that is primarily because there is so much fear of accountability, financial accountability of NAB, that nobody in his right senses is willing to take any decision, especially which requires financial decision making, financial outlays, and public sector enterprises, by their definition, especially the commercial ones, even the non-commercial ones, require financial decision making. If you have to take a decision every time to the ECC, and the ECC then has to take it to the cabinet, this is, unfortunately, we have regressed rather than progressed. What Mehdi was describing was a detailed system, how the 75 industries were managed at the ministry level, and there was no interference from anybody. The Ministry of Finance came in only through its additional secretary or joint secretary, who was at the board of directors. So therefore, I think we are at a very wrong time in trying to do anything in the public sector or trying to improve the public sector, because even entities which are the essential entities like education and health are suffering. I mean, I can tell you about 2 months back, a provincial health secretary told me that, there was a file for the procurement of some equipment for a hospital, let's say for about 30 crores or 40 crores. And the secretaries were preferring to get transferred or wait for their turn to get transferred out rather than sign on that 30-40 crore rupees project, because they were quite sure that they would be called by NAB, if not now, maybe 6 months, a year later. And so therefore, that unfortunately is a price we are paying unintentionally for having gone into this anti-corruption thing and making that as our first priority, that we have actually lost money like this broadsheet case. We've actually, rather than recovering money, we've lost money on the balance sheet.
Right.
But at the same time, the worst result has been that we have brought the government to a standstill. So therefore, the chief executive sitting in Islamabad and those ministry officials with whom they are sitting with the ECC members and the ministers, and the ministers are sitting in the ECC. Everybody is passing the buck up. And, unless the system finds a solution to this, unless it instills back the confidence in the decision makers, the decision that we used to make as a deputy secretary or as a deputy commissioner, as a deputy commissioner, those decisions are being made at the chief secretary or maybe even the chief minister level. And you know, as a deputy secretary, are probably being made at the minister level. That is the deterioration that we have come to. So I think we are talking of a much bigger issue than just following proper managerial methods and, you know, following, you know, incorporating a board of management or incorporating a Sarmaya company and a holding company. To me, those are just marginal things, you know, for the present.
Okay, thank you. Sikandar sir.
May I just come in? May I just come in? I would like to add to what Steam has just said, if you don't mind. Is it all right?
Go ahead. Absolutely.
Yeah. You see, I don't think we ever went to the ministries and the government for 3 days in a week and sat there and talked to them. We took our own decisions. We decided what you had to do, and we had to face the consequences. And I think that is what management is all about. We don't have to go and ask the government if we are in the public sector as what to do. And that is what is happening. If we don't stop doing that, take your decisions and face the consequences yourself. So you don't have to rely on bureaucrats or anybody else for all that. So that's my answer to your question.
Very good. Sikandar sir, I was coming to you anyways. मैंने आपने कहा कि you grew from 15,000 in 1991 to 40,000 today. And when I do the calculation, it comes out to 3% annual growth. Now, is that comfortable? Or should you have grown faster? I mean, इस दौरान में, I mean, for example, Tesla has gone to $1 trillion company, which is almost in your area. And there are other companies that have gone, I mean, even agriculture, some company that's related, Caterpillar, for example, which is kind of related to you, has grown by huge amounts. So why is it that your growth rate has been so low?
I don't think that figure is correct.
Achha.
When we were privatized, when we were in the public sector, from that day to today, we have gone many folds. We have gone from I can't remember what it was, public sector at that time, but today our paid up capital is almost 5 billion rupees, which was not there the case at that time, and the profits have gone up manifold. It was maybe 1 or 2 billion at that time in the public sector. It has gone up to 5 billion now. So, you know, we've gone up many times. The volumes of sales has gone up from maybe 15,000 a year, had went up to 40,000. It comes down, it goes up and goes back to 40,000. So, you know, there is a major difference between private sector to public sector and again to private sector. And I think the company has made tremendous progress during this time. So I can't quote the figures right now. I don't have them in front of me. So I don't want to do that. But the point is that the paid up capital at the time of being nationalized was 2.5 million. Today it's almost 5 billion. So, you know, there is no comparison between then and now. So, you know, as a company, we've done all right. We've done well. Volume-wise, from 10,000, it has gone up to 40,000. And the most important thing is that we have indigenized, we've localized, we have set up a lot of ancillary industry, which is now really the backbone of the automotive sector. We have 350 vending units supplying parts to us, and they are making billions of rupees in this. So I think that in itself is a great contribution.
Great. We should do a study on this.
And also, Nadeem, on this particular thing, just to add to what Sikandar is saying, that all auto industry in this country, auto manufacturing is basically limited by the local demand. They are not into a position for, they have not really reached the level for exports. Billet tractors could export, but I think probably Sikandar would correct me, but they had an issue with their franchise holders, you know, that they were not allowed to export. Otherwise, the only way they could expand from 15,000 to 150,000, 200,000 was the local demand. They're meeting, them and Fiat are meeting, I think, 90% of the local demand in the country in any case. So the export is only possible if either they're not impeded by the sort of franchise holder or the franchisor, or they you know, they have the right kind of approach and the right kind of market to really capture the international market.
You see, to come in again, we have exported almost 2,000 tractors this year up till now, and we hope to export another 1,000 tractors by the end of the year. And our principals have allowed us to do that in Africa. We have selected markets to do that. Of course, it's not completely open for us, but we are now in the phase where we have finished the indigenization process. We are now going into the export process. And I think we are going to do that in this year and in the next year. And the team is very right. We are now pushing in that direction because that is what is required. Thank you.
Arshad Zaman Sahab, I can't let you get away with just pinning down neoliberalism. मैं आपको एक छोटी सी बात पूछना चाहता हूँ कि आपको पता है, I'm sure you know, कि जो fundamental proposition economics में थी कि it really doesn't matter whether it's a command economy or a neoliberal economy, as you say, free market economy, provided you run things properly, right? And based on price signals or whatever. Now the question is, we have realized कि जी हमारा management system इतना deformed है, तस्लीम साहब भी agree करते हैं, अपना सलीम रजा साहब भी agree करते हैं, सब agree करते हैं, हमारा management system इतना deformed है कि हम तो कुछ run ही नहीं कर सकते. तो आप मुझे बताइए कि in this milieu, am I okay in recommending a neoliberal solution and saying कि यार forget the government, they are the pain? Because this is what we are doing in the PIDE. So I'd like your wisdom on that.
I don't know if I have much wisdom to offer, but let me make a few points. First of all, जो neoliberal system था, वो unfortunately जो इंग्लैंड से IMF जो पहुंचा तो वो बहुत dilute हो गया था. Basically, neoliberals assumed कि English common law tradition जो centuries से मौजूद था, वो individual rights को safeguard करता है. And their case was that government expansion impedes on the right of the average Englishman to make a profit in enterprise. And this will come to the next point also. हमारे यहाँ problem ये है कि we never look at our own problems. We are perennially looking at Singapore or Timbuktu for a model to imitate. And वो model इसलिए नहीं carry over करता है कि वो जो infrastructure of governance है, laws, legislature, a responsible executive, an independent judiciary, none of that exists. And that is what affects management as well. क्योंकि जब आपके property rights नहीं established है, तो बाकी rights का आप क्या कहेंगे? यानी I remember early when I came here, so in the Ministry of Finance, the feeling was कि I came from the World Bank. I thought कि भाई external reserves बढ़नी चाहिए. It's very interesting. In America and England, the organization that is called Treasury, हमारे यहाँ is called Finance. Because in sovereign countries, you seek to collect treasure. In colonial countries, you do not want the intermediary who is siphoning revenues towards the center to have any reserves. हमारे यहाँ the job of the Ministry of Finance is to borrow. Now, in this situation, वो management जो है, वो हो नहीं सकती है, जैसा कि तस्नीम ने कहा कि आपका the law system is a weapon in the hands of the powerful. कोई justice नहीं है. कोई you can't rely on the Supreme Court to look after you either. So that basic social and political foundation is not there, and that needs to be taken care of before you transplant neoliberalism. On management question that you raised earlier, I take a slightly different view from what Salim and Tasneem and the others have taken. I don't know whether I'm right or wrong. I'm intimidated by the number of years. I think there are 2 centuries of experience here between the 4 experts gathered here. But in my way of thinking, I make a distinction between leadership, management, and administration. Leaders lead people towards unified goals. हमारे यहाँ unified goals ही नहीं है. अभी भी ये झगड़ा है कि इस्लाम चलेगा या modernity. मैनेजमेंट में मैनेजर्स मैनेज प्रोसेसेस, administrator manage tasks. The tragedy of Pakistan is कि leaders तो खत्म हो गए लियाकत अली खान की assassination के बाद, फिर administrators took over management, और अब ये task यानी this pantomime in the foothills of Margala, which we are supposed to regard as government, is not government at all. यानी क्या हम जब when I imagine कि the equivalent of Queen Elizabeth is Dr. Alvi, and you go down the line, तो वो क्या है, ये मजाक है, ये total pantomime. So the problems of enterprise management come from the larger context of the system of laws and governance, infrastructure of governance कह लीजिए आप उसे. तो आप assume कर सकते हैं अमेरिका में या इंग्लैंड में इसकी बेसिस पे आप आर्थर डी लिटिल जो है वो बेस्ट प्रैक्टिसेस बनाता है. But to move from the negative to the positive, I think what we need is a very realistic appraisal. ये जो तमाशा है मरगला की पहाड़ियों के नीचे, इसको हमारी बेवकूफ़ी होगी अगर हम इसे हुकूमत समझे. गवर्नमेंट एट ऑल. कुछ लोग हैं जो मास्क पहन के एक दूसरे की नकलें उतार रहे हैं. And therefore इनसे कहना कि आप इंडिपेंडेंट एक्शन लें, आप ये कर दें, आप वो कर दें, रिस्पॉन्सिबल हो, आप किंग्स पर्स को पब्लिक पर्स से सेपरेट करें, विच इज द लॉजिक बिहाइंड द टू पार्ट्स ऑफ द बजट. हमने अंग्रेजों से ये लिख लिया है. That doesn't work. So now what do we need to do? We need to realize, to digress, अयूब खान के ज़माने में जब भुट्टो साहब अपनी मूवमेंट चला रहे थे in the last days, तो सरदार बहादुर खान जो उनके छोटे भाई थे वो लीडर ऑफ द ऑपोजिशन थे. तो मुल्क की हालात पे उन्होंने तबसरा किया था, जो शेर मुझे बार बार आज याद आता है. वो शेर ये था, पुराना शेर था, कि हर बर्बाद गुलिस्तां करने को बस एक ही उल्लू काफी था, हर शाख पे उल्लू बैठा है, अंजाम गुलिस्तां क्या होगा. तो हमें we have to realize that this pantomime that we call government will not deliver. The question is कि हम 5 आदमी यहाँ बैठ के क्या कर सकते हैं. And this is why in my presentation I concluded by saying कि forget about giving policy advice to a government that is paralyzed, यानी it's in policy catatonia. You can't ask a catatonic person कि भाई उठो खड़े हो जाओ और बाल्टी उठा लो. Why give him that, even though it may be the more sensible thing? I suspect that the time is certainly running out. The ship is sinking, and if we are to make it in time, perhaps a group of experienced people like Sikandar and Tasneem, and led by Istiqbal, who is probably the world's greatest living authority on public enterprises in Pakistan, should take up a small problem. ये कोई बड़े मसले नहीं हम solve कर सकते हैं. But if we take up a small problem of state enterprise, and under this one-man storm that is Nadeem ul Haq, कि यहाँ तहलका मचा दिया है, अगर आप दोनों हजरात शरीक हो जाएं और आज 2, 3, 4, 5 प्रपोजल्स बहुत मुफीद आए हैं, इनको लेके आप आगे बढ़ें, जिस यानी हस्बे इस्तात जो हमारी इस्तात है. सलीम ने कहा कि DFCs को रिवाइव करना चाहिए. Let us see how this can be marketed. तस्नीम बता रहे थे कि भाई ब्यूरोक्रेसी में क्या मसाइल हैं, तो खैर हमारा राजदा वहाँ बैठा हुआ है, इशरत हुसैन से कहिए कि कुछ करे इसके बारे में. But I mean, let us pick up small things. See if we can build on low ground but firm. तो मेरी नाचीज राय में तो यही कुछ किया जा सकता है. अब बाकी whether the water rises above our heads before we get anywhere.
ठीक. अच्छा सलीम साहब, let me turn to you very quickly कि ये DFCs का जो आपका proposal है, I mean, am I not right that DFCs failed in Pakistan? Am I not right that they were virtually all insolvent and that they had been taken for a ride by the rent seekers? Are we capable of setting up good DFCs in this management system where nothing can be delegated, nothing can be handled? And second, इसका second part भी मैं आपसे पूछ लूं. Why do people not make more use of the stock market? Why is debt market so important? After all, in regular finance, debt and finance are the same. So why don't people get more equity finance rather than just debt finance?
Acha, to answer the first question, PICIC was an institution while it worked till the early 70s. So was IDBP. On the board were donors representatives, so the World Bank was on the board. As it so happens, Bank of America was an investor. Bank of America was on the board. And it worked institutionally. It promoted from within. Yes, the head of PICIC was very often a civil servant, but the experts were all people chosen for skills other than finance because they were meant to advise industry on what to do, on what to choose, on how to put things together. While it was left alone to work as an institution, it worked brilliantly, I think. I think IDBP worked very well. I think even NDFC, which came up later in the early years, was very effective. I think bankers' equity, you ask some of the businessmen here, they'll tell you that bankers' equity got them going. It was putting in private equity, it was putting in venture capital. Then, in the 80s, the entire financial sector collapsed after the nationalized banks became extensions of government policy. And that is really, you see, we shouldn't confuse the earlier public institutions with the later public. When we think of nationalization here, we think of the industries Mr. Bhutto nationalized, which all met a very sorry end. So we think of public sector institutions in that context. But I would say what we'd built up before that, which were run institutionally, were very powerful. You know, we've heard a lot of skepticism about we'll ever work our way out of this paper bag. But, one can, remain convinced, as I am, that we can repeat what we did in the past. It's the same people. And if we can run companies abroad, run businesses abroad, we can certainly do it here. The second on stock market. Yeah, stock market में list होना as a public limited company बहुत disclosure होता है, बहुत comments होते हैं, बहुत तुम्हारी company की analysis होती है. If you go to the public markets, you have to be committed to balance sheet based formal growth with a lot of disclosure, a lot of public shareholders asking questions, and our businessmen by and large don't prefer not to get entangled with that mess. We raise, if you look at the financing of our corporations, less than 1% comes from the stock market. The rest is internally generated finance or debt, and this hasn't changed. So our stock market is a trading platform; it's not a capital raising platform, and that's a fact. Now it's held together by very powerful people, and so it gets a lot. Now you tell me why. Just tell me why the stock market is in the newspapers every day. Abhi 52 ho gayi, 33 ho gayi, 44 तालियां, 44 ho gayi. What difference is it making to anyone except to investors? Is it doing anything for growth? Is it doing anything for employment? So, but why does it get so much publicity? So,
Salim, if you have finished, then I'd like to jump in.
And my second comment on this, our cotton crop is down from whatever it was at its peak, 12, 13 to 6. और अगर हम तालियां बजा रहे हैं कि टेक्सटाइल इंडस्ट्री $3 billion की मशीनरी और खरीदेगी, ये बड़ी अच्छी रिफाइनेंस मिल गई है और बहुत अच्छा मौका है. And like we've heard several times before, our exports are now going to grow at 25%. बस आप गैस की कीमत कम करते हैं और आप हमको बिल्कुल जहां से हम गैस खरीदना चाहते हैं गैस खरीदने दें. And by God, watch us perform. You help, we perform. और जो 6 million bales cotton गायब जो हो गए हैं हमारे crop के, उसकी जो import करना पड़ेगी, how much mention do you see? And why are we in this position? I was talking about Embrapa. Are these things we couldn't help for ourselves? वो sugar में चला गया बहुत सारा cotton, बहुत सारा maize में चला गया because the prices aren't good enough. Why aren't the prices good enough? Because our mill owner can import when he wants to. He is not compelled, nobody is compelled back to improving the quality. Nobody is compelled back to improving the quality of our cotton to get the farmer going back again. 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 million bales. But you won't see mention of this in the newspaper. So I think the way our economy is presented is really tilted to either the export industry or the LSM, which together is about 17% of GDP. The bulk of the remaining doesn't get a mention. There are real issues, there are real solutions, there's a lot that can be done. But there we are.
Okay. Ashwat,
if I might, the stock market, I endorse 100% what Salim has said. Let me tell you a story. In 82, when I came back from Washington, तो मैं अपने मिनिस्टर साहब गुलाम इसा खान साहब थे, उनके पास गया. मैंने कहा सर कुछ स्टॉक मार्केट के लिए करना चाहिए. कहने लगे छोड़ दो, वो तंबोला क्लब है. And it hasn't changed much since then. But the more important point was your first point. And I would mention 2 points that Salim made that I want to endorse. First point is, look, we are back in the 50s. We are back in a position where you have a private sector that is skittish, does not want to invest. And so there is a need now to redo PIDC and PICIC. And I would put NDFC, the late NDFC, as a much more appropriate institution in the context of our discussion of SOEs. Because SOE financing NDFC se hoti thi. And successful institutions were का मॉडल हमारे यहाँ हमेशा sort of जो सिविल सर्वेंट ज़ेरे अताब आया है ना, उसने फाइनेंशियल इंस्टीट्यूशंस बड़े अच्छे चलाए हैं, क्योंकि he has the contacts, and you cannot run financial institutions in Pakistan without having the contacts and having the service strength to resist pressure. वो आफ्ताब अहमद खान साहब सुनाया करते थे कि when he was in NDFC, रात को एंटी करप्शन कमेटी अपॉइंट हुई, सुबह को चेयरमैन आ गया कि जी मेरा लोन फंसा हुआ है आपका. तो you need that combination, but it is a complete falsehood to say that DFCs were a failure in Pakistan. Fashions shifted in Washington, but DFCs were a great success, and so they ought to be revived. I'm
going to hold you to this. I hope you would give us a paper, you and Salim would give us a paper on for PID that you should publish, because I'm still a skeptic on DFCs. But we'll take that up again. ठीक है?
Can I interrupt?
जी, please go ahead.
उसमें देखें जिस तरह से ये TFIs को हैंडल किया गया है, वो भी तो आप देखें कि 2 मिसालें मैं आपको देता हूं. एक तो है NDFC जिसकी अभी बात किया अर्शद ने, और एक दूसरा है IDBP जिसकी अभी बात हुई है. IDBP which was not doing anything, and NDFC which was doing everything, maybe not everything right, but was doing everything. NDFC was winded up, IDBP is still there. What logic, what rationale do we have? Another one, which you don't hear much about, well, obviously not many people remember it anymore, ICP. आधा से ज़्यादा जो आपका स्टॉक मार्केट आज जो डेवलप हुआ है, जैसा भी हुआ है, उसमें ICP का एक बड़ा मेजर रोल था. मगर क्या हुआ, वो किस तरह से प्रॉब्लम जो है, वो प्रॉब्लम क्या है मैं आपको बताऊं. जब मैं NIT को लुक आफ्टर कर रहा था, तो मुझे
जनाब NIT तो अभी तक बैठी हुई है.
आई नो बैठी हुई है, बिल्कुल.
करती क्या NIT, मुझे बता दे.
वो इन्वेस्ट कर रही है, वो पैसे बना रही है.
क्या मतलब इन्वेस्ट कर? इन्वेस्टमेंट तो उनकी 30 साल पुरानी है, कोई नई इन्वेस्टमेंट तो नहीं करते, पुरानी इन्वेस्टमेंट बैठे हुए.
हाँ, that is right. मैं NIT के सपोर्ट में बात मैं नहीं कह रहा, मैं बताने की ये कोशिश कर रहा हूँ कि जो NIT बिल्कुल what you are saying कि NIT जो कि वही कर रहा है जो आज से 10 साल पहले या 20 साल पहले कर रहा था, मगर ICP जो कि बहुत कुछ कर रहा था, जितने भी जो कितने कम से कम 25 उन्होंने खोले थे जो
investment centers.
They have all been closed down. ICP is not there anymore. NIT is still there. तो you see the problem जो हुई है वो ये हुई है कि हम जो है एक चीज को नहीं रियलाइज कर रहे कि हर चीज जो है एक लफ्ज है प्राइवेटाइजेशन. Privatization, I'm not a great opponent of privatization. There is nothing wrong. अगर ठीक तरीके से प्राइवेटाइज करो तो ठीक है. The problem is कि हर तीसरी इंस्टीट्यूशन को, पब्लिक सेक्टर को, जिसको के वो अच्छा काम करना शुरू करे या बुरा काम करना शुरू कर दे, they are on the list of privatization. When they are on the list of privatization, we have not thought of it कि उस वक्त जो उस मैनेजमेंट है वो काम करना बंद कर देती है, डिसीजन लेना बंद कर देती है. मैं आपको बता रहा हूँ एक मिसाल. हमारी एक बहुत अच्छी जो फर्टिलाइजर की यूनिट थी उसका नाम था पाक सऊदी फर्टिलाइजर. वन ऑफ द मनी स्पिनर, वन ऑफ द फनी स्पिनर in the whole of fertilizer industry. उसका मैनेजर जो है मुझे हर साल जब टारगेट सेटअप करने के लिए हम बैठते थे तो हर साल आन के मुझसे कहता था, मेरी साहब खुदा हाफिज, अगले साल तो आपसे मुलाकात नहीं होगी. मैंने कहा क्यों? ये अगले साल तक तो हम प्राइवेटाइज हो जाएंगे. उस दरमियान में उसको ये इंस्ट्रक्शंस आ गई थी कि जी आपने कोई रिसर्च नहीं करनी, कोई BMR नहीं करना, कोई बैलेंसिंग नहीं करनी, आपने, क्योंकि आप प्राइवेटाइज होने वाले हैं. और उसका डिसाइड करना कि कौन करेगा कौन नहीं करेगा वो प्राइवेटाइजेशन कमीशन था. तो कहने का मतलब ये है कि ऑल दीज थिंग्स व्हिच वी टेक डिसीजंस, उसका जो इम्पैक्ट्स हैं वो हम नहीं देखते हैं. और दिस इज वन ऑफ द रीजंस कि हमारी इस वक्त जो है बहुत सारे प्राइवेट सेक्टर, जो पब्लिक सेक्टर एंटरप्राइज हु वर डूइंग क्वाइट वेल एट वन टाइम, अब दे आर वेयर दे आर नाउ. थैंक यू.
तस्नीम साहब, आपसे जरा क्विकली एक चीज पूछ लें कि ये जो कह रहे हैं कि NIT अभी तक चल रही है, NIT के पास मेरा ख्याल उन्होंने कोई शेयर नहीं खरीदा 1980 के बाद. उनके पास तो सारे पुराने शेयर्स पड़े हैं, वो सिर्फ डिविडेंड्स पे चली जा रहे हैं. कोई मतलब नहीं मुझे समझ आ रहा है उनके एग्जिस्टेंस का. नंबर 2, देखिए अगर प्राइवेटाइजेशन की बात करते हैं, प्राइवेटाइज होता तो कुछ नहीं है, सिर्फ बातें होती हैं. एंड वी कीप टॉकिंग अबाउट सरमाया एंड ऑल दिस, कुछ नहीं होता. दूसरी चीज तस्नीम साहब, एक और बड़ी इंपॉर्टेंट चीज है कि IMF प्रोग्राम व्हाटएवर इट माइट से, मैं IMF के साथ बात रेगुलरली करता हूँ, उनको भी ताने देता हूँ कि तुम क्या कर रहे हो भाई साले. कि हमारे आधे रेवेन्यूज से जो हमारी लीकेजेस ना, ऑलमोस्ट हाफ ऑफ रेवेन्यूज. आई मेक अ केस. पब्लिक सेक्टर एंटरप्राइजेज जो उनसे हैं, आपने कहा सर्कुलर डेट इज अबाउट 1.2, व्हिच इज ह्यूज. ठीक है जी. वी हैव लॉस्ट अबाउट 10 trillion अकॉर्डिंग टू आवर कैलकुलेशन, 10 trillion rupees in public sector, sorry, in sort of energy losses in the last 10 years. We lose about 500 billion a year. We lose about 300-400 in commodity finance. We lose PIDE के आपने देख लिए figures, railway के वगैरह. We are losing roughly about 1.5 trillion rupees on the PSCs. We are also losing, अब जो हमने बात ही नहीं की, जिस पे हम बात करेंगे at some stage, आप लोगों को फिर लेके आएंगे, कि हम PSTP में अगर देखें, नीलम झेलम को देख लें, इस्लामाबाद एयरपोर्ट को देख लें, PSTP भी हमारे बहुत तगड़े लॉसेस हैं जो कोई कैलकुलेट ही नहीं करता. तो I would think that the public sector loses roughly half of revenues every year, more than the army, by the way, through these losses, and nobody talks about them. Right now we are losing a huge amount of money, more than our defense budget, and everybody wants to cut the defense budget, but nobody wants to cut the losses of the public sector. फिर ये भी बात हुई मैनेजमेंट की कि जनाब मैंने देखा है, फॉर एग्जांपल बड़ी दफा बात होती है, इवन शकील दुरानी, उसको भी बुलाना चाहिए था, भूल ही गए. शकील दुरानी एडमिट्स के जी सारा वक्त वो बैठा होता था मिनिस्ट्री में. ठीक है. द मिनिस्ट्री रियली वांट्स टू रन दीज एंटरप्राइजेस. दैट्स अ फैक्ट. हमने एनर्जी पे को 5-6 वेबिनार्स कराए हैं विद अबाउट 50 डिफरेंट पीपल, एंड एवरीवन सेज दैट द fault is the secretaries. I'll be more specific. That the secretary likes to run the system. Can this be done? Should this be done? आप बताइए, you mashallah one of the famous secretaries. What do you recommend as a governance change?
देखिए, governance का जो है ना उसका, the problem is that we had local governance which was so-called colonial. But the fayda was that in the era that we were there, the district governance or the district effectiveness was absolute. You know, you could, but unfortunately, इसी चक्कर में कि वो, since there was some bad eggs in the field as deputy commissioners and commissioners, arrogant and, you know, non-available, maybe some of them were corrupt, the whole system was wound up. Now, similarly, there is no system which is right or wrong in my view. Systems evolve in an organization. Wherever you try and reform the systems drastically, you know, you get into a trouble. And therefore, आप administrative reforms की history पाकिस्तान की देख लें कि ज़्यादातर administrative reforms से improvement नहीं आई, खराबी आई है, जो भी थोड़े बहुत हुए. अब present government का देखेंगे 2.5 साल से administrative reforms की बात कर रहे हैं, and they are claiming a lot of administrative reforms. They are really basically just changing the notifications and commas and full stops of the promotion policy and the commas and full stop of the rotation policies, things that have been tried repeatedly. So therefore, I don't think that it is the issue that some secretary is calling too many people. The problem is that the delegation of power which used to be there, जिस ज़माने में कि the public sector enterprises were successfully run, like Millet Tractors was one. There were scores of factories, you know, making fertilizer, making cement, which were successfully being run, and there was no grouse because people were not called to the ministry. अब हो ये गया है कि the political milieu has deteriorated, and the pressure on the secretary is that he will face a blast or a बेइज्जती in every meeting of the cabinet. So he is under pressure. He passes on the pressure to the chief executives or the people under him. And so जो मैंने पहले बात की कि decision making has gone up, you know, rather than being delegated, तो वो सारी impact करती है आपके performance को कि secretaries जो हैं वो या तो अपने performance को समझते हैं बेहतर करने के लिए इस किस्म का उनको micro manage करने की जरूरत पड़ती है, और या ऐसे होते हैं federal secretaries जो कि you know, they maybe stay 6 months, 9 months, a year, and when things start getting hot, they much rather get transferred rather than face the music. So therefore, जो आपका है ना बैठे रहने का जो मेरा ख्याल है तोहमत है, वो it's a reflection of A, individual, and B, the political milieu that has changed and deteriorated, you know. और वो मेरा ख्याल है कि जब तक उस तरफ कोई रिफॉर्म नहीं होगा, और उसका रिफॉर्म होने के चांसेस इस वास्ते नहीं है कि अभी आप देखें कि ये हुकूमत 2.5 साल से आई है, बड़ी गुड इंटेंशन से आई है, और ये कहते हैं कि उनकी सारे जो पेपर पे स्टेटेड चीजें थी while they were contesting the elections were all right, but having come into power, they seem to have lost their way, you know, in this pantomime that Arshad Saab has said about Islamabad. They seem to have lost their way, and it's unlikely to me that they're like, you know, that we're going to find the way in the next 2 years, because they're fighting for their survival and not necessarily for planning something which is big. And so unless we sort out the macro political issues, none of the things that we are talking about will either get improved or, and like Arshad Saab said कि आप ये recommendation भेज दें, आप जो भी recommendation यहाँ से आई हैं आप भेज दें, कोई वहाँ पढ़ने वाला नहीं होगा, यानी कोई आपसे discuss करने वाला नहीं होगा, उसको implement करना तो बहुत बात की बात है.
बिल्कुल सही. मैं देखता रहता हूँ जी तस्नीम साहब, you will be amused. I ask every webinar, are there any civil servants here? And the answer is always no. I ask, are there any politicians here? The answer is always no. So you're absolutely right. In the corridors of power, they're situated in silos where they have no ears, they don't listen, they don't want to talk. That's besides the point. But let me ask one last question from all of you. Eisenhower की बड़ी famous statement है, उसका वो कहता है, plans are worthless, but planning is everything. तो सलीम रज़ा साहब आप बताइए, did Citibank have plans? Did they have announced plans, announced policies? Did they sort of work on things that you were doing? policies and plans very carefully, because हुकूमत में I'll come back to Tasim Rai sir and whoever likes, मुझे तो पहले policy नजर नहीं आती हुकूमत में. In the last 20 years we've sat down and analyzed almost everything that has been done by the donors. हमारी नेपरा की law donors ने बनाई, हमारी पब्लिक फाइनेंशियल मैनेजमेंट की लॉ डोनर्स ने बनाई, हमारी स्टेट बैंक की लॉ डोनर्स ने बनाई. तो हमारी मिनिस्ट्री तो अब काम करना छोड़ दिया है. तस्नीम साहब ठीक कहते हैं, दे वर एडमिनिस्ट्रेटिव ब्यूरोक्रेसीज. बट ये तस्नीम साहब बहुत पहले वे बैक जब बंती आया था 1958 में, तो वी took on the bureaucracy took on the mantle of development, although we should have had a separate development bureaucracy. Now the development bureaucracy, the bureaucracy is divided. तो मैं काफी दफा इस पे लिख भी चुका हूँ. Go back to the magisterial role. Magisterial role छोड़ दिया. Everybody wants to do development. Development से आगे people want to manage public sector enterprises. इसके साथ एक और चीज है, DFI सलीम साहब exist कर रही हैं. एक तो पाक सऊदी, पाक लिबिया, ये तो बड़ी अच्छी, they are very good. Again, I've analyzed them. बड़ी अच्छी नौकरी है for retired bankers. I mean, you get them and they're great nौकरीज. I don't know what they do, but they exist. So where's the game?
They invest largely on the stock exchange.
So what's happening? The DFIs exist. Bankers get great jobs. They get paid 50 lakhs a month. What are they doing?
You know what should happen with the DFIs is, through agreement with all the investing governments, we should merge them, create one solid development bank, and make it work our objectives. But anyway, that's one solution for them.
पर ये मुझे बताइए ना, ये जो पहली बात थी कि जी, did you have plans in Citibank and policies? And why does the government not have them? You've been, mashallah, Governor Central Bank. Do we have any plans and policies in the government?
I think banate plans, I think they're set aside and they're sort of ignored in the breach. I think my planning horizon is 1 year, disrupted several times in the course of that 1 year. So we neither have plans, nor do we have indicative plans, nor do we have plans that look at some horizon that one way or the other will get there. So I agree. I mean, there is a total void, and that creates a void in vision, and that makes that's why your policy making, economic and commercial policy making, is subordinated either to the needs of IMF or to the needs of a big business. Without planning, you cannot prevent it. And that's where we are today. I would really go for I would say that number one, if it can be done, is to put the Planning Commission back in the saddle where it was once. And it doesn't have to plan 5 years and 1 year. It can give you indicative planning. It can coordinate the requirements. It can decide on allocation of finance, which today is outside the power of public sector enterprises. Everything is done by the finance ministry. So, Coach, you were there. Did you see hope in the Planning Commission being able to get back into some kind of guidance role?
Nope, not at all. Not at all. अच्छा साहब बताइए.
मैं कह रहा था ये कि नदीम, the government plans and the people plot. And plots are usually more successful than plans. हमारी planning जो है is all plan documents in 4-color print on glossy paper are marketing documents. Anybody who understands government realizes that the activities of governments are strategic. अगर हम किसी जनरल से पूछे कि तुम लिख के मुझे दे दो कि प्लान क्या है तुम्हारा of attacking India, तो as वो German general said, all war plans are useless after the first bullet is fired. तो जो तुम जिस पॉलिसी की तुम तलाश में हो, वो पॉलिसी एग्जिस्ट करती है. वो एग्जिस्ट करती है क्लोज मीटिंग्स में, कहीं लिखी हुई नहीं होती है. किचन कैबिनेट दैट मीट्स बिफोर द कैबिनेट मीट्स, जो 3-4 आदमियों की 5 आदमियों की होती है, जो रेगुलर फीचर है. यानी अगर 10 बजे कैबिनेट है तो 9:30 बजे वो मीटिंग होती है. कहीं उसकी मिनट्स नहीं होती है. कैबिनेट डिवीजन हैज नो नॉलेज ऑफ इट. दैट इज वेयर पॉलिसी इज मेड. पॉलिसी मीनिंग प्लान्स टू बी इम्प्लीमेंटेड. बाकी हम पर मुतालबा इतना होता है. वो कहता है जी, वर्ल्ड बैंक वाले कहते हैं कि हमें ये प्लान चाहिए, रोलिंग प्लान चाहिए, जंपिंग प्लान चाहिए, स्लिपिंग प्लान चाहिए. तो वो हमने एक मशीन लगाई हुई है, वो प्लान बना के देती जाती है. It isn't that there isn't any planning. Planning is the plots are there. जो चीज तुम्हें नजर आती है कि हमारे प्लान सारे कुछ नहीं है, they are not working. Psychologists have a phenomenon called strategic helplessness. वो ये कहते हैं कि एक न्यूक्लियर साइंटिस्ट होता है, वो दफ्तर जाके बम बनाता है, घर आके कहता है अपनी बीवी से कि मुझे मोजे नहीं मिल रहे, तो बीवी उसे मोजे तलाश करके देती है। तो इसको स्ट्रेटेजिक हेल्पलेसनेस कहते हैं। तो जब डोनर हमसे आके कहता है कि साहब हमारी ख्वाहिश ये है कि हम जुमा के रोज नमाज के बाद आपके सेक्रेटरी को सड़क पे ले जाके 2 थप्पड़ मारे, तो हम कहते हैं दैट्स अ ब्रिलियंट आइडिया, लेट्स फॉर्म अ कमिटी एंड द कमिटी विल कम अप विद अ रिपोर्ट। अब वो वर्ल्ड बैंक में जाके वो अपना बैक टू ऑफिस रिपोर्ट लिखता है कि जनाब वो द गवर्नमेंट इज टोटली इनकॉम्पिटेंट। आई वाज सरप्राइज्ड व्हेन आई केम टू गवर्नमेंट कि हाउ कॉम्पिटेंट गवर्नमेंट इज इन द थिंग्स इट वांट्स टू डू। मेरे पास एज इकोनॉमिक एडवाइजर एक्सपोर्ट्स और इंपोर्ट्स के स्टैटिस्टिक्स विद इन आवर्स आ जाया करते थे अक्रॉस द कंट्रीज until the computers destroyed it. फिर वो जो पुराने लोग थे वो कहते थे सर अगर आपको फौरन चाहिए तो मैं हाथ से करके देता हूँ, कंप्यूटर से 3 दिन लगेंगे। तो the answer to your question is that there are policies, but if anything is public, it is not a policy, it is marketing.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. I think this has been a very interesting seminar. और बड़ी देर हो गई है unfortunately, so I think we should close it down. Istiqbal Sahab, I'll call you to round it up so that we can close it down. जी. मैं unmute कर ले इस्तकबाल साहब.
Thank you, Nadeem. Once again, as I said earlier, that it was a pleasure having the most professionals around. Nadeem, all I can say is that which I said earlier, that it was some kind of a music to my ears. For one reason is that not only that public sector was not condemned, but there was also some thoughts which came out about it, and I hope we are able to do something about it. And as you yourself had proposed that we should not have one seminar or we should have a series of that, maybe 2 or 3 like that, and maybe we should start planning for the next few, and maybe ideas from the present company, and they can give some proposals. What are the various areas where we should focus on? Personally, my feeling is, you see, I'm not being biased or anything. Somehow this whole privatization and talk is becoming very damaging. The reason I'm saying is that there are a number of things which are not being done simply because that is going to be privatized. It's a part of and which is not going to, and which is not even being privatized. And that is the worst thing, that you're talking about it. And the result is, the other day, I saw, and I was shocked when I saw, my last bank, which I had, heading, that was the agriculture bank. And I was told that has come on the privatization list. No problem. If you can privatize, go ahead. But you are not going to privatize it. The result is that whatever it is doing in so many days, probably even that is not going to. Can you imagine a bank for the last 3 years did not have a board? So those are the things which are damaging, and I think it will be useful when we have the next 2 or 3 subjects to focus on, and one is the various impact of privatization. I'm not saying that there should not be privatization, but it is that there should be some kind of thought about it. That how do we approach and minimize the damages which is being caused by by saying something and not doing it. So with that, Nadeem, thank you very much. I would once again thank you for encouraging the subject, and I hope we shall be able to pick up some thoughts from there, and then carry on in the forthcoming webinar which we are going to have.
Thank you, Mehdi sir. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Salim Raza. Thank you, Tasneem Nurani. Thank you, Sikandar sir. Thank you, Arshad Zaman sir. I will just say this, Kiji, we are very grateful to you for coming to PIDE and helping us do this. Our initiative at PIDE is really to establish a national narrative and a research agenda. And these webinars are directed towards the kids. We've had a day. Let's try and lead them with good ideas. And what I find in academia is we are researching, as Arshad said, on crazy topics. Hamara research agenda koi nahi national, bas donor hame jo batata hai, hum wo kar dete hain. And with the result that there is really clearly no domestic debate on any issue. For example, most of our kids don't even know what a DFI is. They don't even know what Pak Saudi is. I think we really need to educate these kids on these issues and talk to them about it. So we're trying to establish, through these webinars, we're trying to establish national research agenda. We are linking these webinars to a research fund, which is called RASTA, Research for Social Transformation and Advancement. And that RASTA is creating a countrywide research competition. And we're trying to mainstream these webinar subjects onto that fund. Our student community, our university community should start thinking about these things. They are right now trying to only emulate the West, and we want to get them out of emulating the West. So let's see how it goes. It's an experiment. It's worth trying. I don't think it can be done in a very quick time. But we will do these webinars again and again, and we'll invite you again and again to give your wisdom. After all, you have, mashallah, got a huge amount of knowledge. And we will try and, abhi hamare bache jo hain, they will transcribe this webinar, not transcribe, they will summarize it. We've already had about 100 plus webinars, and our kids have prepared a book based on these webinars, and we are going to prepare another book this year. So whatever you've said is going to be translated into a paper, and it will be taken up by research professionals. So that's the whole purpose of these webinars. We will invite you again and again. We will, inshallah, repeat this again. The idea is to learn, and thank you very much. Thank you for helping us learn.
Thank you. Thank you very much.